I never thought my wedding day would end with flashing lights, federal agents, and the president of my HOA screaming that I was a criminal. The morning had started like a dream. Soft sunlight through the oaks, white chairs lined along the lawn, and the sound of my fiancée laughing inside the house. But even before the ceremony began, something felt wrong. The neighbors who used to wave were suddenly watching from their porches. A black SUV crawled down the street, too slow to be casual, and at the end of the cul-de-sac, Marlene Parker, our HOA president, stood with her clipboard pressed tight against her chest. Her lips curved into that little smirk she always wore before she ruined someone's week. I tried to ignore her. I really did. But when she and two board members marched across my driveway, heels clicking like they were on official business, I knew she wasn't here to congratulate me. The vows hadn't even started when she began snapping pictures of the arch, the chairs, the catering tent. Every flash felt like a warning. I caught her whispering to one of the men beside her, and the way he nodded made my stomach twist. By sunset, I understood. The moment we said I do, she filed her first complaint. And that was only the beginning. Because within 48 hours, I wasn't just facing fines for decorations. I was being investigated for building on federal property. The FBI on my wedding week, all because Marlene decided my happiness violated community standards. The worst part? She thought she'd win. She thought no one could touch her. But what she didn't know, what none of them knew, was who my father was, and what he'd do once he heard what they tried to pull. They say, love can drive people crazy. But power? Power makes them dangerous. And when an HOA president with too much pride and too many secrets decides to ruin your life, how far are you willing to go to take it all back? Keep watching, because what started as a petty neighborhood feud turned into a battle that shook the entire community. There's a certain kind of quiet that lives in neighborhoods like mine, a silence that feels planned, managed, and approved by committee. Every blade of grass trimmed to regulation height, every driveway power washed just enough to sparkle, but never enough to drip onto the sidewalk. The kind of place where everyone waves, but no one really smiles. Oak Hill Estates, that's what the sign said at the entrance, carved into white stone and framed by perfect hedges that always seemed to stay the same height no matter the season. When my wife and I first moved in, we thought it was paradise. Clean streets, polite neighbors, a private lake that shimmered gold in the evenings. After years of renting apartments with paper-thin walls and broken elevators, owning a home here felt like a dream. A 2-story brick house with a wraparound porch, an oak tree that shaded the front yard, and enough space out back for summer cookouts. I remember telling her, this is it. This is where we'll build everything. And for a while, it felt true. The HOA wasn't something I paid much attention to at first. They sent welcome letters with glossy pamphlets about community harmony and preserving property values, rules about trash cans and mailbox colors, fence heights, approved lawn treatments. It seemed harmless, just structure. I even thought it was good, the reason everything looked so perfect. That illusion lasted about a month. The first sign came one morning when I noticed a small yellow card tucked under my doormat. Reminder, lawn maintenance violation. Apparently, the grass had grown 1 inch above the standard height. I laughed it off, trimmed it the same afternoon, and didn't think much more about it. But later that evening, I saw her, Marlene Parker, HOA president. She was out walking her dog, a perfectly groomed white poodle with a rhinestone collar, clipboard in hand. Marlene was the kind of woman who made silence feel like judgment. Early 50s, immaculately dressed, always smelling faintly of gardenias and self-righteousness. Her walk was brisk, purposeful, like every step came with a checklist. When she passed my yard, she stopped, adjusted her sunglasses, and smiled. But her eyes didn't. "Lovely place you've got here," she said. "Just keep an eye on that lawn. We wouldn't want to set a bad precedent." A bad precedent. I remember the way she said it, like a warning disguised as neighborly advice. Behind Marlene stood her board, 3 people who followed her lead like loyal disciples. There was George Miller, the vice president, a retired accountant who seemed to measure the world in decimals and fines. Every conversation with him felt like a balance sheet. Then came Tricia Boyd, the secretary, a woman who wore pastel cardigans and carried gossip like oxygen. If Marlene wanted something known, Tricia made sure the whole street whispered it by sundown. And finally, there was Ken Holt, the compliance officer, a man with the personality of a traffic cone. Ken never smiled, never spoke, unless quoting HOA bylaws, and always seemed to appear when you least wanted him to. They ran the neighborhood like a small government. Monthly meetings in the community clubhouse, agendas printed and stapled, motions seconded and passed with all the seriousness of a courtroom. At first, I thought it was overkill, but people seemed to go along with it. Maybe it was easier that way to follow the rules than to question them. My wife, though, saw it faster than I did. She'd frown when the HOA newsletters arrived, those long, sterile lists of reminders and courtesy notices. "Doesn't it feel a little much?" she'd ask. I'd shrug. It's just how they keep order. But little by little, that order started to feel like control. It began with the mailbox. One morning, Ken stopped by to inform us that ours was non-compliant. Apparently, the shade of black wasn't officially approved. We replaced it with one from the HOA's list, only to receive another notice a week later about the font size on our house numbers. It would have been comical if it hadn't been so persistent. Each notice came with a fee. Small at first, $25 here, $50 there. Administrative processing, they called it. I started noticing it happening to others too. The elderly couple next door got cited for a decorative violation because their wreath didn't match the season. Another neighbor was fined for leaving his trash cans out for more than 30 minutes past the designated retrieval time. 30 minutes. It wasn't long before the street began to divide. Some neighbors, the ones who'd been there the longest, treated the HOA like royalty. They'd mow twice a week, repaint their shutters, and brag about their perfect compliance record. Others grumbled quietly, sharing stories in hushed tones during late-night walks. But no one ever stood up to Marlene. She had a way of making people feel small, like every argument against her was proof that you didn't belong. One afternoon, I saw her walking with George near the lake. She was pointing toward a neighbor's yard, gesturing sharply like she was marking territory. That's when I realized this wasn't about keeping things beautiful. It was about control. Every rule, every fine, every carefully worded letter was another reminder that she decided what was acceptable. But I didn't see the full extent of it until I tried to make a small change myself. My wife and I wanted to install a simple pergola in the backyard, something elegant for shade and summer dinners. I filled out all the required forms, attached the sketches, submitted the permit request, and waited. Weeks passed with no response. Then, one afternoon, an envelope appeared in our mailbox, stamped "Denied." The reason? Design not in harmony with community aesthetic. When I called to ask for clarification, I was told if you'd like to appeal, you can attend the next board meeting. I showed up that Thursday evening, thinking I'd have a fair chance to explain. Instead, I walked into a performance. The room was filled with folding chairs and stale coffee. Marlene sat at the head of a long table, the board flanking her like a tribunal. Every sentence I spoke was met with polite smiles, clipped nods, and vague phrases like, "Unfortunately, our decision is final." It was my first real taste of their power. Afterward, as I was leaving, Marlene caught my arm gently. "Nothing personal," she said, smiling. "We just have to maintain standards." "You understand, don't you?" I did. But not in the way she wanted me to. Over time, the notices kept coming, each one smaller, more absurd. Unapproved mulch color. Improper positioning of garden lights. Flagpole exceeding visual height limit. Every time I'd fix it, thinking that compliance would end the harassment. It never did. If anything, the more I followed the rules, the more they found new ones to enforce. The turning point came when I started noticing the cars. Black SUVs, the kind with tinted windows, parked at odd angles down the street. They never stayed long, just long enough for someone inside to jot notes or take photos. Once I even saw a flash, a camera lens reflecting sunlight from behind a half-closed window. When I mentioned it to a neighbor, he lowered his voice. "They do that sometimes," he whispered. They're keeping records. Marlene likes documentation. By then, the community had turned into something else entirely, a place of fear disguised as order. People walked their dogs a little faster, waved a little less. Conversations on the sidewalk would cut short if Marlene happened to stroll by. Even kids playing in the cul-de-sac would go quiet when she appeared. Still, I wanted to believe it was just pettiness, that none of it would really go too far. I was wrong, because then came the wedding. We'd been planning it for months, a simple backyard ceremony surrounded by friends and family. Nothing extravagant, nothing out of line. I checked the HOA guidelines 3 times to make sure we weren't breaking any rules. Temporary event tents were allowed, outdoor gatherings permitted until dusk. Parking overflow allowed along the side streets with advance notice. Everything was by the book, or so I thought. The day before the ceremony, I got an email from Tricia. The subject line read, "Community reminder, proper conduct for private events." It was written like a newsletter, addressed to everyone, but it might as well have had my name in bold at the top. All residents are reminded that gatherings exceeding 20 guests must be pre-approved to ensure noise compliance and property preservation. Unauthorized events may be subject to penalty. I called her immediately. She claimed it was just a routine reminder, but I could hear the satisfaction in her tone, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what she was doing. That night, I barely slept. I kept looking out the window, watching the darkened street. A single street light flickered near the cul-de-sac, throwing long, uneven shadows across the pavement. Everything was too still, like the calm before a storm. My wife told me I was overthinking it. Maybe I was. But when I saw Marlene's car roll by around midnight, slowing as it passed our driveway, I knew it wasn't paranoia. The morning of the wedding dawned bright and still, a perfect day, at least for a few hours. The chairs were set up. The arch was draped in white fabric. Music played softly as guests arrived. For the first time in months, I felt peace. I thought maybe, just maybe, she'd let this one day go. Then, halfway through the ceremony, I saw movement at the edge of the lawn. Marlene, red dress, sunglasses, clipboard in hand, and behind her, 2 men I'd never seen before, also in suits. They stood there watching, scribbling notes like my wedding was a crime scene. My wife's hand tightened in mine. I tried to keep my voice steady as we said our vows, but I could feel their eyes burning into me, judging, documenting. When it was over, when we kissed and the crowd clapped, I looked up just in time to see Marlene smirk and walk away, like she'd already written the next chapter of whatever game she was playing. I didn't know it then, but that was the moment everything changed, because in Oak Hill Estates, peace wasn't free. It was rented, 1 fine, 1 rule, 1 humiliation at a time. And I was about to find out just how far they'd go to make an example out of me. The letters, the agents, the late-night threats, all of it began here, under that perfect blue sky, on the happiest day of my life. And if I'd known what was coming, I would have never let her take that first picture. It started the very next morning. A bright yellow envelope taped to my front door like a scarlet letter. Notice of violations. Bold, all caps, impossible to miss. The same day I married the love of my life. 5 violations, 5 new ways my happiness had apparently defiled the integrity of Oak Hill Estates. Unapproved signage, meaning the wooden welcome board my wife hand-painted. Improper outdoor structures, the wedding arch where we said our vows. Noise disturbance, unauthorized parking, and my personal favorite, use of community property without written consent. My own backyard, apparently, was now community property. The total fine? $3,200. I stood on the porch, still in yesterday's shoes, staring at that envelope as if it might apologize. When I finally called the HOA office, an assistant answered, monotone and detached. "You can appeal in writing or pay online," she said. And then, click. She hung up. That's when I realized this wasn't bureaucracy. It was war. I walked out to the curb, looked down the quiet tree-lined street. Every house looked perfect, calm, undisturbed. But I could feel it, eyes behind curtains, blinds twitching. By sunset, everyone in the neighborhood would know. Not because they'd seen the notice, but because Marlene would make sure they did, and she did. The next day, Tricia, the board secretary, gossip queen, pastel sweater and pearls, stopped me as I was unloading groceries. "Oh, Daniel," she said, smiling too sweetly. "We heard about the misunderstanding at your wedding." Such a shame, a misunderstanding. That's what they called it. I didn't reply. I just stared until she shifted her weight, then forced a brittle laugh. "Well, you know Marlene. She takes the rules seriously. Keeps us all safe." Safe. The word curdled in my stomach. 2 days later, the situation escalated. A black SUV pulled up in front of my house. 4 men in dark suits stepped out. Not neighbors, not city officials. They moved with the precision of law enforcement. One flashed a badge. "We need to speak with you about unauthorized use of government property." Government property. I thought it was a joke until one of them handed me a folder. Inside was a report, detailed, official-looking, stamped. It accused me of building a temporary structure on federal land, filed by Marlene Parker. They took photos, measured the lawn, poked around the fence line like I was smuggling state secrets under the rose bushes. When I looked up, there she was, standing halfway down the block, arms crossed, sunglasses glinting, watching, smirking. That smirk told me everything. This wasn't about a rule. It was personal. When the agents left, I made one phone call to my father, retired military, current county sheriff. I told him everything. There was a long silence. Then he said just one thing: "Stay put." 15 minutes later, 2 squad cars rolled into Oak Hill Estates. My dad stepped out in full uniform. The HOA patrol, yes, they had their own security volunteers, scattered like ants. When he saw the folder, his jaw tightened. "Who filed this?" he asked. I pointed. Marlene was still watching. He walked right up to her, calm, controlled. "You realize filing a false federal report is a felony, right?" Her smirk faltered, but only for a second. "We have rules in this neighborhood," she said, voice clipped, almost trembling. Dad leaned closer. "You have rules. That doesn't give you the right to weaponize law enforcement against homeowners." The agents, embarrassed, backed off. Dad showed them the property deed, the boundary lines, the legal documents. They left without another word, but Marlene didn't. She hissed as she passed me, "This isn't over," and she was right. Within a week, the fines started piling up again. $4,500 $500 for improper landscaping, $2,100 for parking obstruction. Every envelope was thicker, more formal, more threatening. I started keeping them in a shoebox because the stack wouldn't fit in a drawer anymore. Then came the noise complaints. Apparently, my lawnmower was excessively disruptive. My porch light violated illumination guidelines. One morning, a note appeared claiming my garbage cans were visibly offensive and negatively impacting community harmony. I was being buried alive under paperwork. At first, I tried to fight it. I attended every board meeting, filed written appeals, cited their own bylaws. It didn't matter. Each argument I made became another reason for them to review my property. They'd send Ken, the compliance officer, clipboard in hand, face blank as stone, to photograph my house. He'd circle things that weren't even issues: a loose shingle, a crack in the sidewalk, a leaf stuck in a gutter, and every week, more fines. Then, one afternoon, I noticed my mailbox flag missing. Not broken, gone. I shrugged it off until the next morning, when a bright red sticker appeared on the box. "Mailbox non-compliant? Replace immediately." That's when I realized how far this would go. The worst part wasn't the money. It was the way it infected everything. My wife stopped gardening because she was afraid of unauthorized planting. We stopped sitting on the porch because we could feel eyes on us. Every car that slowed near our house felt like surveillance. Every neighbor's wave felt cautious, rehearsed. Then, one night, I found proof. A black sedan parked across the street, engine off, lights out. I snapped a photo, but as soon as I stepped outside, the car pulled away, no plates. Just taillights fading into the dark. The next day, I brought the photo to the HOA office. The receptionist, same monotone assistant, glanced at it and said, "We'll make a note." A note. That was their answer to being stalked in my own neighborhood. I was running out of patience. So I went straight to the source, the board minutes. Legally, they had to let homeowners review them. At first, they resisted, said they needed to schedule a review appointment. I pressed harder. When they finally handed over the binder, I took one look and felt my stomach drop. Every fine, every violation, every absurd rule, they'd all been voted on, and not just broadly approved, targeted. My address was listed, 4 votes in favor, 1 against. The lone dissenter, David Harland, HOA treasurer. I didn't know David well. He lived 3 streets over, quiet guy, mid-60s. Retired engineer, if I remembered right. That night, I went to find him. He was watering his lawn when I walked up. When I mentioned the board minutes, his shoulders sagged. I told them this would happen, he said softly. He invited me inside, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and told me everything. They've been abusing the system for years, he said. Most people just pay the fines to avoid trouble. You embarrassed Marlene at your wedding. That's why she's fixated on you. She needs to prove she's in control. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder. These are my personal notes. Expenses that don't add up. Vendor invoices that lead nowhere. Repairs that were billed but never done. I flipped through them, disbelief turning to rage. Fake companies, missing funds, signatures that didn't match. This isn't just harassment, I said. It's theft, David nodded. She treats the HOA like her private bank account, and anyone who threatens that, they get buried in violations. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at those documents, at the endless chain of lies. My house wasn't the only one. She was bleeding the entire community dry, so I started fighting back, quietly, methodically. I printed copies of everything, the fake invoices, the SUV photos, the board minutes. I kept them in a binder labeled HOA records. Then I went door to door. At first, no one wanted to talk. They'd smile politely, say they hadn't had any issues, and close the door. But by the 3rd block, things changed. An older man showed me a $600 fine for leaving. Halloween decorations, up 2 days past November 1st. A woman across the street pulled out a letter about her dog barking during restricted hours. She didn't even own a dog. A retired veteran said he'd been fined $500 for flying an oversized flag. Every story pointed to the same source, Marlene Parker. The following weekend, I hosted a neighborhood cookout. No speeches, no confrontation, just burgers, drinks, and quiet conversations. But people talked. And as the sun went down, something started shifting. Neighbors who'd been silent began comparing stories. They realized it wasn't just them, and that scared Marlene. The next morning, I woke up to find 2 massive orange barricades blocking my driveway. Each had a laminated sign, "Driveway closed, pending safety inspection." 3 weeks, the notice said. 3 weeks with no access to my own driveway. 3 weeks of humiliation. Every neighbor driving by, seeing those barricades like a public shaming, but instead of hiding, I sat on my porch with a cup of coffee and waved at every car that passed. When they slowed down, I told them exactly who ordered the barricades. By sundown, half the neighborhood knew. The whispers turned into anger. People stopped being afraid to talk. Some even started bringing their own letters and fines to me, asking for help understanding them. My binder turned into a full-blown dossier. That's when Marlene made her next move, a white envelope taped to my door. No return address. Inside, a notice of investigation. They were accusing me of illegal surveillance, claiming my security cameras violated privacy laws. The same cameras that had captured the black sedan watching my home. When I showed the notice to David, his face went pale. "They're laying groundwork," he said. "She'll build a paper trail until you look like the aggressor." He was right. That night, the black sedan came back. Parked farther down the street, but I knew it was the same one. I took photos, close-ups this time, and when the car drove off, I followed. It didn't go far. Just down the road to a cul-de-sac where George Miller lived. The next morning, George stood in his driveway smiling as I drove past. He waved, that smug, knowing wave of a man who thinks he's winning. I sent the photos to David. He called immediately. "That's one of Marlene's enforcers," he said. "They hire people off the books to collect evidence, scare homeowners. It's how they control the narrative." It made me sick. But it also gave me focus. I decided to expose them. I organized another neighborhood meeting, unofficial, in my backyard. By 7 p.m., it was packed. Folding chairs, paper plates, neighbors clutching envelopes like confessions. I stood up, held Marlene's latest letter in the air, and said, "Who here has been fined for something that isn't even in the bylaws?" Hands shot up. Voices erupted. Stories spilled out. People who'd never spoken to each other before were united in one emotion: anger. David stepped forward, laid his evidence on the table. "This isn't enforcement," he said. "This is embezzlement," the crowd roared. Some wanted to storm Marlene's house right then. Others talked about lawyers. But I knew better. Marlene would twist it all, claim we were spreading misinformation. We needed undeniable proof, and we got it. David called me late one night. His voice was low, tense. "I found something," he said. "Meet me." "Not here." "Somewhere off property. We met at a diner outside town." He slid a manila folder across the table. Inside were bank statements, handwritten notes, receipts, thousands of dollars marked as landscaping improvements paid to companies that didn't exist, payments to consultants with P.O. box addresses, and then the bombshell, a transfer to Marlene's personal account, disguised as administrative reimbursement. I stared at the paper, heart pounding. "We can end this," I said. David's eyes were grim. "Be careful. Marlene doesn't fight clean." He was right, because the next morning another letter was taped to my door, this one printed in red. "Final warning. Continued defamation of the HOA board will result in legal action." That night, a photo appeared in my mailbox. My house, taken from above, like through a second-story window. On the back, 3 words: "We are watching." I didn't sleep. I barely breathed, but fear has a breaking point, and I had reached mine. So I did the one thing Marlene never expected. I fought back in her own arena. I requested a special HOA session. The rules said any homeowner could, if backed by 10 signatures. I had 30. When the night came, the clubhouse was packed. Marlene sat at the front, her board around her, smug and poised. I walked in with David and my binder. Before she could speak, I said, "Before you find me again, maybe you should explain this." I hit play on my phone. Her sister's voice, recorded on my porch the day she called the agents. "Arrest them all. They're trespassing." The room went silent. Marlene's face drained of color. "That recording is inadmissible," she snapped. Someone from the back shouted, "Sounds admissible to me." Laughter rippled. Even George shifted uncomfortably for the first time I saw it. Fear in her eyes. The meeting exploded into chaos. People demanding answers, shouting for audits, threatening lawsuits. Marlene slammed her gavel, but no one listened. Her control was cracking. When I walked out that night, I thought it was over, but I was wrong, because when people like Marlene start to lose power, that's when they become truly dangerous. And as I reached my front porch, I saw it. Another envelope taped to the door, only this one wasn't printed or stamped, just a single piece of paper handwritten in perfect, looping cursive. "You've made a mistake. Daniel." The war for Oak Hill Estates had only just begun. The morning the war broke open, the neighborhood was silent. The kind of silence that comes before a storm. Not peace, not calm, just a deep suspended breath. Every driveway was still, every curtain drawn, every porch light flicked off early, as if the entire community already knew something was about to explode. I didn't yet know that by nightfall, everything about Oak Hill Estates would be changed forever. It started with a knock. 3 sharp raps on my front door, fast, impatient, and heavy. When I opened it, 2 men in navy windbreakers stood there, clipboards in hand, badges gleaming under the morning sun. "Mr. Carter?" one asked. "We're here on behalf of the Oak Hill Estates Homeowners Association. We've been authorized to serve you a cease and desist notice." The phrase hung in the air like smoke. Cease and desist? What exactly? The man handed me a thick folder for harassment, defamation, and violation of community bylaws through unauthorized distribution of HOA documents. I laughed, but it came out dry and bitter. "You mean the evidence of Marlene's embezzlement?" The other man's expression didn't change. "We're just delivering documents, sir." As they turned to leave, I noticed a small crowd gathering down the street, neighbors watching from their lawns, whispering. Marlene stood among them in her beige blazer, hair perfectly curled, lips pursed, in what looked like triumph. I could feel her satisfaction from 50 feet away. That was her move. A final show of dominance. She wanted to humiliate me, to make an example of the man who dared challenge her authority. But she had no idea what was coming, because that morning, as those men walked away, I already had something she didn't know existed, irrefutable proof, not just paper trails or missing receipts. Actual video footage showing Marlene's husband withdrawing HOA funds from an account labeled Community Reserve. David had found it on a hard drive buried in an old office laptop, one the HOA had thrown out years ago but never wiped clean. When he showed it to me 2 nights earlier, my entire body went cold. There it was, time-stamped, recorded, undeniable, and today was the day I was going to show it to everyone. The special community meeting was set for 6 p.m. at the Oak Hill Clubhouse. It was supposed to be about budget transparency. Marlene had scheduled it to calm the growing unrest, to show she still controlled the narrative. What she didn't know was that I'd spent the last week quietly making copies, digital and physical, of every piece of evidence David and I had collected. By the time evening came, cars lined both sides of the street. The parking lot overflowed. Even people from neighboring subdivisions showed up, drawn by rumors of a scandal big enough to shake the whole district. When I walked through those double doors, every eye turned toward me. Marlene was already seated at the front, flanked by her board, George, Tricia, and 2 others whose names I didn't even bother remembering anymore. Her expression was sharp, cold, and confident. "Well," she said into the microphone, voice dripping with false civility, "it seems our most enthusiastic resident has joined us. How wonderful!" Polite laughter rippled through the room, thin and uneasy. I took a seat near the front, my binder clutched tight in my hand. My heart was pounding, but not from fear anymore. This was adrenaline. This was the moment I'd been waiting for. Marlene began her usual speech, budget projections, community goals, maintenance updates. The same carefully rehearsed performance, but I wasn't listening. My eyes were on the projector setup at the back of the room, one I had arranged earlier with the building manager, who'd finally grown tired of the board's bullying. When Marlene finished her presentation, she opened the floor for comments. "As always, we value community feedback," she said, smiling sweetly. "Please, one at a time." I stood. "I have something to share," her smile flickered. "Mr. Carter, you've already received a cease and desist notice." I'd advise, but I was already walking toward the front, binder under my arm. "No," I said. "Tonight, the community deserves to hear the truth." Gasps and murmurs filled the room. Someone called out, "Let him speak!" Another shouted, "We've waited long enough!" Marlene's hand tightened around the gavel. "If you persist, you'll be escorted out." I didn't stop. Instead, I turned toward the back of the room and nodded to the building manager. The lights dimmed and the projector flickered to life. The first image appeared, a screenshot of an email. Subject line, reimbursement authorization. Beneath it, the HOA treasurer's signature and a routing number that matched Marlene's personal bank account. The room went silent. Then came the next slide. Bank transfers, invoices, falsified repair orders, and finally the video. The grainy security footage played across the big screen. Marlene's husband, Richard, standing at an ATM withdrawing thousands of dollars in cash. The timestamp aligned perfectly with one of the landscaping maintenance payments on record. The crowd erupted. Voices rose, angry and disbelieving. Someone shouted, "That's theft!" Another yelled, "How long has this been going on?" Marlene froze, pale as paper. This is taken out of context." She sputtered, gripping the edge of the podium. I stepped forward. "You've bled this community dry. You've weaponized the rules to silence anyone who questioned you. You filed false reports, issued illegal fines, and used our money to fund your personal projects. We have the evidence, and now everyone has seen it." George stood up, face red. "You don't know what you're talking about." David rose from his seat in the second row. "Actually, we do." He held up another folder. "Here are the financial records I personally audited. Signed and dated by Marlene herself. These numbers don't lie." The crowd turned on them instantly. Dozens of neighbors stood, demanding answers, voices overlapping in fury. Marlene tried to shout over them, slamming her gavel again and again. "Order! Order!" But no one listened. Then a sound cut through the chaos, the wail of police sirens approaching in the distance. Heads turned toward the windows as two patrol cars pulled up outside the clubhouse. The doors swung open and officers stepped in. "Marlene Parker," one said. "We have a warrant for your arrest." The room fell into stunned silence. Marlene's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked from face to face, as if searching for someone to defend her. But everyone had turned away. Even George, who had stood by her side for years, slowly backed away from the table. The officer read her rights as she stood frozen, trembling. The gavel slipped from her fingers and clattered onto the floor. I should have felt triumph, but what I felt was something deeper, heavier. Justice, yes, relief, but also exhaustion. Months of stress, fear, and rage pouring out of me all at once. As they led her out in handcuffs, a murmur swept through the crowd. Some people cheered, others just stood in shock. The control she'd wielded for years, gone in a single moment. But the story wasn't over. 2 nights later, a vandal broke into my garage. Tools smashed, car tires slashed, camera wires cut clean. It wasn't random, it was revenge. The police took the report, but the message was clear. The web Marlene spun didn't unravel overnight. There were still people loyal to her, or at least terrified enough to act in her name. I started sleeping with my phone by the bed, checking every shadow on the lawn, every car that lingered too long at the curb. But something had shifted in the neighborhood. Where there had once been silence, now there was solidarity. Neighbors I barely knew started checking in. They brought food, offered help repairing the damage. One even helped me install new security lights. The fear was still there, but now it was shared. A week after Marlene's arrest, the HOA held an emergency election. David was voted in as interim president. The vote wasn't even close. When he stood before the community, his first words were simple. "This board belongs to the people again." Applause filled the room, loud and cathartic. I stood in the back, hands in my pockets, just listening. But the climax, the true climax, came a few weeks later in court. The case drew media attention. Reporters outside the courthouse, cameras flashing, Marlene, pale and defiant, insisting she'd been framed by a disgruntled homeowner. But the evidence was overwhelming. The footage, the emails, the financial trails. Even her husband, under pressure, confessed to helping her redirect funds. When the judge read the verdict, guilty on all counts of fraud, embezzlement, and harassment, the courtroom exhaled as one. She didn't even flinch, just stared straight ahead, eyes empty, as if she'd finally realized the thing she'd built, her empire of control, was gone forever. Outside, the cameras turned to me. A reporter asked, "Mr. Carter, how does it feel to have brought justice to your neighborhood?" I hesitated before answering. "It's not about me," I said. "It's about the people who were too scared to speak. It's about reminding everyone that power, no matter how small it looks, can still be abused, and it's up to us to stop it." The story went viral within days. News outlets picked it up. People across the country shared their own HOA horror stories, inspired by what happened at Oak Hill Estates. But for me, the real victory wasn't in the headlines. It was the morning I stepped outside and saw my wife planting flowers again, the sound of laughter returning to our street, the sight of kids playing basketball in driveways without someone filing a complaint. The control that once choked the life out of our neighborhood had been broken, and in its place, something new was growing, still, even now. Sometimes I think back to that night at the clubhouse, the flicker of the projector, the faces illuminated in shock, the weight of that truth finally breaking loose. And I wonder if, deep down, Marlene knew this day would come. If maybe in her final moments of control, she felt it slipping through her fingers like sand, because power, once weaponized, always turns on its wielder, and for me, for all of us, it was never just about fines or fences or bylaws. It was about taking back something she'd stolen long before the first violation notice appeared. Our peace, our dignity, our home. The night of her sentencing, I walked past the clubhouse one last time. The lights were off, the air still, the gavel still lying cracked on the floor where she'd dropped it. I stood there for a long time, staring at the dark windows, and then, quietly, I whispered, "We're finally free." But even freedom, I've learned, carries its own echo. Because somewhere out there, people like Marlene still exist, waiting for another neighborhood to control, another board to dominate. So when I see new neighbors moving in, I tell them the same thing. Pay attention to who wants the power and why. Because once it starts, once the rules stop being about safety and start being about control, it's already too late. And sometimes the quietest streets hide the loudest wars. Peace doesn't erase what happened. It just gives it context. It lets you see the cracks and realize how much light they let in. Every so often, though, I still catch myself wondering what happened to Marlene. I've heard she's been released early on probation, living somewhere up north. Maybe she's changed. Maybe she hasn't. People like her rarely do. But I hope she remembers Oak Hill not with bitterness, but with understanding. Because in the end, even she taught us something valuable. She showed us what happens when authority loses accountability. She made us stronger by trying to break us, and if she ever drives past our neighborhood again, I hope she sees what we built from the ashes of her rule, a place that finally lives up to the sign at its entrance. Oak Hill Estates, a community that cares. That phrase used to feel hollow. Now it means something. Looking back, I realized the story was never about a wedding, or fines, or even revenge. It was about reclaiming ownership of something that should have never been taken, our right to live without fear. And as strange as it sounds, I'm grateful. Grateful for the chaos, for the sleepless nights, for every letter taped to my door, because they forced me to wake up. So here's the truth, the one I want every viewer to remember long after this story ends. Home isn't just the house you live in. It's the people who stand with you when everything falls apart. It's the courage to say, enough, and maybe that's the lesson Marlene never learned. No amount of control can buy respect. No number of fines can manufacture belonging, because real community isn't built on rules. It's built on trust. So the next time someone tells you they're just enforcing policy, take a closer look. Ask who wrote those policies and who they benefit, because sometimes the greatest threat to peace isn't chaos. It's control disguised as order, and sometimes the only way to protect your home is to fight for it.